Sure. We got two things going on at the same time. The first is that the Americans have lost interest in supporting the global system, so it's spinning apart. Even if we wanted to continue to play the role that we've played since 1946, our Navy has changed. We've got 12 super carriers now and very few destroyers. We can't patrol the global oceans to protect commerce, which means that we have to choose who is safe and who is not, and we have a list. Most countries are not on it. Second, when the Americans created the globalized system back in the 40s, it allowed everyone to move off the farm and into towns and take manufacturing and services jobs. Well, when you move into town, you have fewer kids because instead of being free labor on the farm, they're now just really, really expensive pieces of furniture. And so you have fewer of them because adults aren't dumb. You fast forward that 70 years, and we've got 70 years of demographic destruction that is now all coming to a head. Most countries, especially in the advanced world, but also several in the advanced developing world, have now aged past the point of possible theoretical repopulation. So it's not just that we're running out of consumers and producers, it's we're running out of capital producers. And very soon, this moment of wealth that we've been living in since roughly 2000 is going to pass because those people who provided the consumption and the wealth are now moving into mass retirement. We've never experienced something like this in global history before, and it's going to be a rocky road. You have to understand why we've done what we've done. So the United States created the global system in order to bribe up an alliance to fight the Cold War, and in that it worked. And we provided global naval patrol so that anyone could ship anything and work with any partner at any time and access any market. So for the first time in human history, your cargo ships didn't necessarily need a military escort. And that meant that we went from having a few dozen of them to a few tens of thousands of them over the course of the next 70 years. But since the Cold War ended, the United States has steadily changed its naval disposition. So we're in the process right now of floating the new Ford class. They're the most powerful vessels ever it's the most powerful military platform used by any country in any era. We're going to have 4 of them. One by itself has the aircraft capacity of the 7th most powerful Air Force in the world. And that's assuming it's a fair fight, which it never would be because aircraft carriers can move. Mm-hmm. So really, you're only talking about 3 countries in the world that might be able to fend off one of these. We've got 4 Fords and 10 Nimitzes. That's a lot. I mean, if you want to knock off a country, this is how you do it. But if you want to patrol the global oceans, you need many, many, many more points of contact. 14 carriers isn't going to cut it. So you need hundreds of destroyers, almost 1,000 probably these days with the volume of traffic we have. We have 70. So there's no theoretical possibility for the United States or any other country to take that role up. People like to talk about the Chinese having more ships than we do. Yes, but 90% of them are small, and 90% of them can't sail more than 1,000 miles from the coast. So they're useless in trade management. Well, in the shorter term, we're probably going to have a series of military conflicts, much like the Ukraine war, when local regional powers, whether out of desperation or opportunity, decide to carve out their own new sphere of influence, with the Americans largely gone. The Russians are starting in Ukraine. That is hardly the end of the story. There's about a dozen countries that they're going to be going after, assuming they are not defeated in Ukraine. In the case of the Chinese system, it means a collapse of the manufacturing model. Even if Xi didn't have an incredibly destructive force of personality that was destroying manufacturing in the country in real time, and even if the COVID vaccine in China worked, and even if China had a demographic structure that could survive the decade. All of these are kind of non-negotiable at this point, but let's assume for the moment that these are not problems. China is completely dependent upon global commerce for raw materials, especially energy and food, and then for merchandise exports to the wider world. And they're completely incapable of securing those routes themselves. So best case scenario for China is probably an 80% reduction in their standard of living and probably reduction of their population by half. They're the country that is going to suffer most from the deglobalized system. And I'd argue that we're getting very close to that cliff edge right now. It was just a couple weeks ago that the Greeks and the Iranians were confiscating each other's ships. Yep. And, the Greeks do not play that game. So to have a minor power that registers a lot of vessels now starting to get in on trade, enforcement isn't the right word. Let's call it non-integration. It gives you an idea of how far this has gone. If you're looking for the next step, the Europeans are no longer allowing their insurance firms to insure cargoes of Russian oil.
Right.
That's 95% of the insurance market that is no longer applied. So it is going to be up to individual sovereign nations to provide sovereign indemnification, which, if you want to talk about something that would crash the Russian system and establish exactly what a sanction really means, can you imagine now one of the Western nations grabbing one of those ships when another country has offered the insurance policy? So they have to suck up the entire loss. I mean, you're talking multi-billions. This is going to get really interesting really fast. It's not just the Donbass.
Mm-hmm.
The Russians are hoping to reestablish a more defensive perimeter. Most Russian territory is open, it's flat, and it's middling farmland. So you have a relatively light, well, actually not relative, you have a very light population density through even the populated parts of the country. And whenever a foe gets into the Russian heartlands, it becomes a war of movement. And since the foe had to move to get there, they tend to outperform Russian forces, which are very static and slow.
Right.
And so Russia has been invaded 50 odd times throughout its history. What the Russians are trying to do is preempt the next invasion because their demographic is in free fall. And they know that if they don't do it now, they're going to not have a chance later. So they want to forward position forces in the access points that that are gateways to the Russian territories. Two of those gateways are on the other side of Ukraine. So it's not just that Russia is not going to stop until it gets all of Ukraine. Russia is not going to stop when it gets all of Ukraine, which is one of the reasons why the NATO countries are so desperate to stop it here, because there's 5 NATO countries on the next list. Let me start by saying that Americans aren't happy unless we're stressing about something. So, when the Soviet Union fell, we found a new boogeyman. That's just how we are. It's one of our endearing quirks, in my opinion, because it means that we're always running a little bit faster than we would otherwise need to be, and that keeps us on our toes. But the story of China, the story of Korea, the story of Japan, the story of Singapore, the story of most of East Asia is globalization. When globalization allowed countries to move off the farm and into the cities, in Asia, it happened in mass. And in Asia, the density of the population pre-industrialization was the highest in the world. So in the industrialized era, we just got these mega cities that are absolutely dependent upon supply chains that stretch around the world. But that also means their demographic collapse is the fastest in the world. So Korea and China are by far the two that are furthest along. And the only way a country that has more people in their 60s and 50s and 40s than their 30s, 20s, and 10s is by exporting. So they absolutely have to remain integrated. And if something happens to that integration, they don't have an economic model. The problem that we're seeing in Japan and Korea, and to a far lesser degree Taiwan right now, is it's not just that they have more people in their 40s, 50s, and 60s, it's that the bulk of them are now on the very urge of retirement. And so they're not going to be able to maintain the productive system either. This all breaks this decade. That's when all of these countries age into mass obsolescence. So we have already seen in China the fastest increases in wages over the last 22 years of any country in any era in all of history. There is no longer a manufacturing subsector in China that can't be done cheaper in North America. The only reason we still think of China as a manufacturing hub is because of the sunk cost of the industrial plant, and that's not insignificant. We can't replace that overnight. But every time something relocates from China, it has a better supply chain that's shorter, that's cheaper, that's closer to the end consumer and higher quality. So there's nothing left for the Chinese to excel at, and they're facing the demographic bomb at the same time. Familiar story in the United States that if we don't have somebody that we're stressed about, we start stressing about each other. And we all have seen in recent years how much fun that is. But it's part of our geography. When the United States was settled for the first 150 years, it was just expanding into some of the best farmland in the world with the best navigable waterways in the world. So everything was just easier, and it got better every year for 150 years. We don't have a cultural framework built into our identity of threats. We expect everything to get noticeably better constantly. And so when it doesn't, we kind of lose our shit. 9/11 is a great example. Obviously, it was a tragedy, 3,000 dead, but as a side effect of our military interventions in the Middle East, we put the sharp end of American power on either side of every major trade and energy artery on the planet.